how about one more facts about the vax? Pseudo-science edition on this episode of Pushback.
Go, Jonny, go, go. Go, Jonny, go, go. Go, Jonny, go, go.
If you're concerned about the direction our culture is heading, then maybe it's time to push back.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pushback. I'm Dr. Jonny, and yes, this is another facts about the vax. You know, I believe this will be my 22nd episode regarding COVID-19. I went back in time and did a walk through memory lane. My first one I released was on March 18th, 2020, called Science and Virus and Bears, Oh My. And I believe it's still one of my most listened to podcasts as the COVID virus was just coming into place. And of course, I carry a unique perspective as a physician and of course lived through the following 2-3 years of COVID, which was not the most pleasant time of my life. It was rough and it was an interesting time to live. On February 2nd, 2023, I released my last facts about the vax called Autopsy Report, where I just looked back on some of the things that we were talking about and wanting to give some idea of what we just walked through. And so here I am talking about our children and how our culture affects children, and science is a big piece of that. Science is a subculture of education, and I believe there is a pseudo-education, there's a pseudo-science that's being released that isn't based on good science. And so when I talk about this, and I'm finishing up sort of this second section of the things that influence our children, the things that are killing our children, I feel like I would be remiss to not explore this idea of what happened during the pandemic and how it affected children. Right now, interestingly, we're entering into a season where people are doing the hindsight is 2020. The speculators are coming out, looking back and posturing themselves as if they now have great insight on what we just went through as a pandemic. And so I want to offer, through my medical experience, through my firsthand experience as an emergency physician medicine doctor caring for these patients, and my experience in podcasting as I've researched this for you and tried to give you the best information that I could and keep you informed the best that I can. I would be remiss to not connect this to this pseudo-science. How much of what we experienced was quote-unquote real science? How much of this was pseudo-science? Because now people are coming out and saying, well, none of it was based on science and we made bad choices. And it's so easy after the fact, when people's lives aren't at stake, for us to begin to posture and to say, well, it was handled poorly and wrongly. Dr. Fauci went before the members of Congress and was grilled, I believe somewhat dishonoringly, regarding this topic. And has he done it perfectly? No, and I think he would admit that. We're all human beings walking through something that was unprecedented. But the way that even some of the Republicans treated him, I really felt was wrong and dishonoring to him. So can we just go through a quick walk through memory lane? It's probably something that most of us are wanting to forget. But we know that right around when 2020 started, there was this strange virus breaking out in China and spreading fast. And when it really caught the attention is when it started to sweep into Europe, and most specifically in the country of Italy. I remember that they were the ones that were hit hardest. Italy has a very high elderly population. And very quickly, the medical community in Italy became overwhelmed, and they had to do the unthinkable of turning away people for them just to go home and die. It was it was the worst, and the world was watching this in horror as it was unfolding before us, and it began to hit our West Coast, if you remember that, I believe in the Seattle area, Northern California and things, and began to move quickly. There was certainly a fear that that was going to be us as well. Then came the term flattening the curve. And the idea and the thought behind this scientifically was that if we can mitigate the spread of the virus, then it gives us time then to set into place medical structure and backbone to take care of a wave, a surge of very sick people. I remember was sitting with my family listening to the press conference from Governor Walz from Minnesota, and not a big fan or supporter of his politics, but I thought he did an excellent job at laying out what was at stake. This idea of flattening the curve. If we can social distance, if we can have temporary shutdowns of school and businesses, then this would give us weeks potentially to set into place the medical structure needed to care for severely ill people. That included ICU space, the ability to intubate, and ventilators to sustain life, as well as time to begin and research on vaccination, which I'll get to in a little bit. But here's the part. He laid out, Governor Walz laid out such a beautiful game plan, and then the game plan actually was very quickly executed. And Minnesota, using as an example, quickly created space for ICU patients and ventilator acquisition. Interestingly, though, once that happened and the game plan was executed, nothing seemed to change. And that's the part that begins to start scratching our head a little. Operation Warp Speed was then implemented by the Trump administration, which I believe was the absolute right thing to do. Now, I've taken heat, even in conservative religious circles, regarding my support for vaccination. I'm standing behind it, and I believe sincerely that my recommendations were correct and has proven to be true. I was a proponent of vaccination, not because these particular vaccines had time to be effectively studied, which is always scary and unknown, but because of the track record of vaccination, period. And it seemed to be always the key and the connected piece to ending the dirge of pandemic in history. Now, it didn't prevent transmission as would have hoped. We were hoping that those that vaccinated would then be sort of, quote, immune from getting COVID itself. However, it did absolutely change the course of the disease and death, without a doubt. In fact, there was a moment when they were doing studies on the people who were in the ICU on ventilators, the very sick patients. Of the 100 patients that would be on ventilators, only one would be unvaccinated. That means 99 out of the 100 were unvaccinated. It became a pandemic of the unvaccinated. So the vaccine had absolute qualities that decreased the severity of the disease, without a doubt, irrefutable. Those that were vaccinated, even if they got COVID, got a much milder case of this. Ultimately, herd immunity was achieved and the pandemic ended. That's what we'd expect to have happened with mass vaccination, and that is exactly what happened. And so I will stand by my stance that why the vaccine was so important, and hopefully try to convince some of you that it would be important as well. Now, I was unwavering in my position that I never believed, still don't believe, that the government lockdowns and mandates were the right move. I believe that always, and especially it's in the American blood and history, that the government's job is to inform the people and then allow the people to make an informed decision. And I believe with my whole heart that if the government would have taken that position, that actually more people would have adhered to social distancing, to wise mitigation of viral transmission, and vaccination. I believe because people would have been informed, but instead of the mistrust rose when somebody mandates something to you and says, this is just the best for you, take it. You're forced to, you can't work without it. You can't move around the country without it. And so I believe that was an error looking back on the way it was handled, and hopefully would be handled differently in the future. But let's make no mistake about it. This was unprecedented, unknown. And now for people to be posturing and saying, well, our children were adversely affected, people were locked down, people lost their job, the economy was dinged. All of those things are true and that did happen, but these are spoken by people who were not in authority, were not in charge, and were not responsible for the lives lost and affected by this vaccine. Yes, we found out later that it disproportionately affected the elderly and not the young. However, the young still were a harbinger, a place where this virus could take off. If we opened schools right away, the virus would have been rampant, and those who were elderly and vulnerable would have been more exposed. And so we erred on the safe side, and I believe it was the right move initially, why we flattened the curve and got ready. Once we were ready as a medical community, that's when I believe those guidelines should have shifted and changed. So there was definitely a control piece that took place, but make no mistake about it, it was about saving lives initially. And as we learn more, yes, things could have been shifted, could have been changed, but that's hindsight in 2020. When you're actively in it and you're the one making the decisions, you're always going to err on the side of caution and life. Why would you not? And so, yes, it's unfortunate that the economy was dinged. It was unfortunate that children did have a piece of suffering from being out of school. Were masks absolutely necessary? We'll talk a little bit about that. There's an article that was released June 5th by Nicole Russell from the USA Today. I thought it was a very frustrating article to read, honestly. And so I want to point and counterpoint what she wrote. And the headline is, COVID guidelines cause millions to suffer. Now Fauci admits there was no science behind it. So that headline certainly got my attention, because this is what I've been talking about lately, about science versus pseudoscience. And keep in mind that Dr. Anthony Fauci is not a politician, although obviously his decisions had political effects. His job was to be the overseer of a global pandemic. And so his job was to mitigate the effects of the virus. His job wasn't lockdowns or closing buildings or schools. Those were political decisions, yes, based on his recommendations, but his only goal was to save lives, period. So the politicians were responsible then for taking that information that he gave and putting it through the filter of public service and find out what is best for the people. So she wrote, when COVID-19 hit in 2020, I jotted down a makeshift will for my 4 kids under 12. It wasn't official, just a set of instructions for my children and others in the immediate family members in case anything happened to me. Bank accounts, passwords, and access to other valuable information the family might need were included. It was the beginning of the pandemic, and we had no idea just how serious things would get. Now, don't forget that sentence, because that's, I believe, key and what was so frustrating about what she continued to write afterwards. As a single parent, I worried that if I suddenly caught it and died, my children would languish. The virus was rampant and the risk of dying seemed high and very real. Fear and anxiety took hold. COVID-19 deaths weren't exactly uncommon. The pandemic killed more than 1 million Americans. And there have been about 104 million confirmed cases in the United States alone. That's confirmed, so it's certainly higher than that. A lot of decisions were rooted in fear and brought with them life-changing consequences. Statewide lockdowns, shuttered businesses, school closings, all were based initially on the social distancing rule of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We're now getting answers to questions those decisions raised. In his testimony to the House Oversight and Accountability Committee on Monday, Dr. Anthony Fauci, former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and former chief medical advisor to President Donald Trump, said the 6-foot social distancing rule, which the CDC originally recommended, had not been backed by a clinical trial. This is despite constant claims that COVID-19 protocols were based on science. Now, that's a very disingenuous paragraph right there, because him saying the notion that he would implement a clinical trial at the beginning of a pandemic is preposterous. He has to make the best decision based on what he knows so far. And so he is making a recommendation that we should social distance with the idea of flattening the curve. It made perfect sense. This idea that it was not based on science is the fact that it wasn't based on a clinical trial, which he said later is actually what he meant by not based on science. So there's a critical difference. We would be roasting him today if he decided to run clinical trials over months while people were dying. These disclosures are damning and maddening for all of us who have structured our lives around these rules for years. As a result, millions of people suffered needlessly. Suffered is different than dying. How about people dying needlessly? That's a bigger statement. It's a super disingenuous paragraph. On Monday, Fauci also asked to clarify his comments during the 2-day congressional testimony he gave in January. He specifically responded on Monday to questions about the 6-foot rule. It had little to do with me, since I didn't make the recommendation, and my saying there was no science behind it meant there was no clinical trial behind that. So let's just put that to rest. He's just talking about clinical trials. It would have been irresponsible for him to start clinical trials before he actually implemented common sense measures during an unprecedented pandemic. He also admitted in January interview that there was little science that backing requiring children to wear masks in public and at schools, in public and at schools for almost 2 years. Now you can argue that masking was unnecessary. We can look back and we can learn from that. And that's the most important thing that we should be posturing ourselves on right now, is how can we do better next time? Did masks actually help or not? Initially, masks were the absolute right thing to do because we didn't know. She writes, the real effect of social distancing, which Fauci basically admitted Monday in January's testimony, was just an educated guess. Yes, educated guess. That's what scientists can do in these situations. Doctors do it all the time. It devastated America's economy, small business, and families. It interrupted the fabric of life. For what? The CDC's now infamous 3 weeks to flatten the curve turned into months for students and families living with the consequences. Closing schools was devastating to kids, especially poor or otherwise disadvantaged children. Remote learning wasn't as effective as in-person learning, and especially in the first year, as teachers had no time to prepare. Kids fell behind their grade levels. Pandemic closings resulted in 2 decades of learning loss. All of those might be true, and again, we learn from those after the fact. And I 100% agree that the hunger and the control that took place during that time was not let go. And I believe that was an error that we should do differently next time. But it's also our responsibility to understand our freedom in that. Anxiety and depression skyrocketed without argument from me. Now she wrote, this is not a matter of hindsight being 2020 either. People, including myself, were calling for schools to open in the fall months after the pandemic began, predicting it would continue to be harmful. It is absolutely 100% hindsight being 2020. Now, I do believe that there was a point where we could learn. There was a point where we could take care of the sick. There was a point when vaccinations began to kick in, and there was a point when we realized that it was not affecting the young as much. That I believe that the relaxed guidelines should have been implemented, and for whatever reason, they were not. Fauci did concede that some COVID-19 preventive measures may have gone too far and led to harmful outcomes. He said it is very, very clear that public health officials in the future should consider the potential collateral negative effects of controversial ideas like requiring masks, and asks how we can do better next time. That's where public health officials and politicians work together to say, what is a common ground? What is the most important way that we can protect, educate families, get out of the way, let them make their own decisions, and still protect our communities? That is the question. It's such an important question. Which leads me to this podcast and what this podcast is all about. I believe science is a beautiful thing, and I believe someone like Dr. Fauci, who is willing to step in and do the best that he can to make initial understanding, is important. But I also believe that there is an issue of control. And we're talking about this over and over and over again as we talk about these cultural truths affecting our children. Why was control not easily let go once it was taken? Because that's what control does. We have the responsibility to see that and realize that there's consequences to releasing our freedoms. There's no better example, I believe, maybe in history than this pandemic. There is a place where we operate in safety and security for our family. And I believe where scientists come in is that they educate the public and they say what is true, what is valuable, what is important, and you make the decision for your family. That's the way this society is supposed to work. But there was a clear overstep at some point when the initial initiatives were met where that control was not let go, because control is hungry for control. Control begets control. And we need to be careful going forward and set ourselves up to be better informed if there is a next time. That's how we learn. This podcast is also about honor. I'm not waving the flag of Dr. Fauci. I believe in a lot of ways he's an American hero for stepping in and carrying something and now dealing with this backlash of those who are posturing towards him and now feels like they had it all figured out from the beginning. That's a bunch of baloney. In fact, there's a lot of people that I've challenged over these last 3 years regarding their pseudo-science and where are they now? All the ones that said all the women were going to be infertile, all the ones that say that we have markers that are tracking us in our bodies, all those people that came out and said that that's real science, where are they now? I don't hear them stepping up. I don't hear them defending. The data simply was never there. It was pseudo-science. Did Dr. Fauci have it all right? Was that all perfect science? Probably not, but he did the best with what he could. And we can learn from that so that next time it's that we improve ourselves. And we can have a conversation in honor, even if we completely disagree. That's how we move forward as a society. And really what this boils down to, again, is our children. How are our children affected? We protect them, but we also have to understand that we need to move forward with society and the things that we have for them. And yes, there was absolutely the increase in anxiety, depression, and falling behind educationally. It had consequences because it was a pandemic. It was a devastating scourge on the history of America and the world. And there's going to be consequences with that. I will always err on the consequence of life and preserving life. As a physician, I had firsthand experience of the devastation of the virus, and it was horrible. And yes, I did suffer from something called precaution fatigue. I think it's a real thing. I was sick and tired of gowning and gloving and masking. And did it go on too long in my experience? It probably did. But we can learn from that. And science can help us with that. That's what it does. We can actually do a post-mortem on everything that's happened. And that's how we should approach Dr. Fauci, is what could we do better? What would you do better? How can we position ourselves rather than these trite political attacks on him for whatever reason? So I feel strongly about this. This is so central to my profession and the things that I had to work through with COVID. I take it very personally. And I do believe the vaccine was effective and helpful. And I appreciated so much people who would listen to my point of view, even if they didn't agree with it. It's an incredible time of history, and it's interesting to go back and walk through memory lane. And hopefully we'll never have to experience that again. That's what I certainly pray. but it's the truth that sets us free. And that's why I hope that I can be helpful even in these conversations. Would you contact me at pushbackculture.org and leave a message about this or other comments about the things that we walk through, what you're seeing now? We can all admit that it's hindsight is 2020, but what are you seeing now? What are you concerned about going forward? What are you concerned about with our freedoms, and what are you concerned about regarding our children? Thanks for listening to my heart on this. I look forward to connecting with you again next week. So let's go together now to set and shape the culture.